Hello.
Hello.
Let me share my screen. Wait 1 second. Does anyone know when Andrea is coming back?
Next week.
Okay, next week. All right, good, good, good.
Well, I mean, he'll be back from vacation next week. I don't know if he'll be back. So,
Ah, gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, I mean, we just need one extra maintainer at this point. Like it's been very hard. So okay, let's like to get anything like merged in. So,
yep.
uh,
Uh, uh, I get you.
yep, yep, yep. Okay, so let me June 9th. 9th. Participants. Do this right here. Oh, wrong place. Here. This one. All right. So we got a few things on the agenda today as well. Um, so I did see the demo. Did you see?
Hmm.
So it looked really good. Yeah. Sorry, I was out that week. I was sick. So I'm unfortunate, but I did see the demo. So out of curiosity, did you want us to give you feedback like in a document, like how? Because I did have some questions and some that might be better like if I like laid it out like the time when you spoke and then like the exact question to maybe give you a little bit of context. But overall, I really like the demo though.
Yeah, so it was essentially just the demo. It wasn't really, it was more to show a thing, but if you have questions, I
Hmm.
definitely would, well, more than happy to answer any questions that you have.
Okay.
And not again, that's to show the mechanic. It's actually not the full tool. This is just the base mechanic that provides what the Cedrus expressions are all about. Uh,
Oh,
so that
that makes a lot more sense now. Okay, sorry,
right,
sorry. I thought okay, that clears up all actually almost all my questions then.
right. That
Um,
was only what that was about. This is how the
okay, okay.
Cedrus expressions work. But the
Um,
rest of it's coming, and that's what we're going to. As I mentioned in the demo, there's a playground that we're going to open up in the next probably next into next week.
mhm,
And that will let any of the groups who want to see the mechanic and actually play with it a little bit, they'll be able to, make your own expressions and basically fire some stuff through the setup to see how that would interact. But the real goal here is to introduce a new paradigm where, the tools emit something to the plane, and then you
mhm.
can immediately do work with it. And so if you're like a compliance officer or something, and you can say to the teams, hey, be sure your tool admits X event, and then that's the end of it. I mean, and you just connect to their software that way.
Okay, cool, cool. Yeah, I look forward to it. I'm really curious to see like the next few months like what you guys are able to to build and deliver. So yeah, yeah, keep us in the loop because it looks
Okay.
it looks really promising.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, and then so for the agenda today, I wanted to bring up some of these because these are the new things and um, let's see here. This, which is okay. So this was me trying to understand the intention of environments in CD events. So um it was less about like trying to change anything, but just trying to understand like what we're trying to do with it, right? So one thing I kind of noticed, because like when I think of environment, whenever we talk about it, right, like I always think about it like prod, dev, QA, but that's not what it is in CD events. Like CD events and environment is a cluster group. So is that how we want to define
Wait,
it?
why does it have to be a cluster group?
Because
I mean,
that's literally what it is. Like that's why it's so confusing because that's not how environment is typically used.
well, wait,
Um,
why do you say that's what it is? I guess that's what
because
I didn't know that
if
there
you
was
go to the
something.
docs, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So if you go to the docs real quick, where is it? I think it's in deployments. If you go to, yeah, here. It's an environment in a platform which may run a service. And if you look at the IDs, it's the examples, right?
Well,
These
it's
are
the I that's
all,
what I'm saying, Ben. The IDs, just because it's in the examples, that doesn't necessarily constrain the you know what I mean? It's just it's a slot, dude. I mean, I guess I see it as a slot. You put whatever in it you want to put.
yeah, but
Um,
that's kind of my point in this environment. Like what I'm saying is it's kind of conflating those two things together. That was kind of my point.
oh, I guess I don't think it's that it is opinionated by design. Like it doesn't enforce that it has to be a thing. And so if it doesn't enforce that it has to be a thing, how can you say that it has to be that thing? I guess that's what's confusing me about it. Because you're saying it like it's forcing you to say it has to be that thing because it was in the examples.
Well, yeah, because if you look, right, yeah, it's like, well, then what is it then? You see, like if we're gonna govern this, right, like we need to know what it is, and that's what I'm asking, right? Like what is it then?
Well, you just said it could be used for that particular thing and the other things that you just said, right? What would happen if
Yeah, so
someone
that
used
that
it
would
for
be
prod?
conflation, right? Because if
It's
it's
it's just an I guess that's what I'm saying, dude. If you want to call it conflation, that's fine, but it's not a forced conflation. It is, yeah, the term, that's the problem with most of these things, that all of this stuff is ambiguous. That's the problem that the Cedric's expression is actually trying to solve, is that,
yes, agreed.
it's super ambiguous. And yeah, someone could use it for environment for one thing, and then someone could use it for environment and the other. But what you actually are, it sounds like you're proposing is that you split it up and you have one for one thing and one for another thing that are essentially just different types of environment. And so that's what, you know, I,
Well, yeah, I don't know what the solution is. I just wanted to call out that because environment is so like basically loosey goosey, right? Like it's kind of like almost like whatever you want it to be. It makes interoperability like much more difficult, and that's why
doesn't, not from my perspective, but yeah, okay.
well, yeah, because what you're doing is you have to build an abstraction layer on top of it to enforce something. That is a problem with interoperability within a CD events, right?
No, that's,
Yes, yes.
well, can we agree to disagree?
No, because it's very obvious, right? Like, because if you think
No,
about
it's
it,
not
no, no,
obvious.
it
If it
is
was
because a
very obvious,
tool,
then that would
no, no,
be,
no, no.
oh
Okay,
God, Ben,
look.
look, it's okay for people to disagree, yes?
Oh yeah, yeah, but like,
Okay,
listen,
then
okay, like,
I am
so
listening.
yeah, no, but it makes no sense though. Is my point because like if you have two tools that are supposed to be interoperable and defined in two different ways, how are you supposed to slot in a new tool with the same environment and then it completely works differently?
Then the tools aren't interoperable.
That's my well, my point is that because the tools aren't
If
interoperable, the problem is because the environment is conflated. That's the issue.
Again, I disagree. I think you just said the thing where the two tools don't treat environment the same way, so they're not interoperable by definition. They have two different environment concepts. Those are tool things, not the label of the thing. If you'd like to split those up to enforce those tools to be separate, I get what you're saying, but then we have to say, okay, what type of tools use it this way, what type of tools use it that way, and then you are
No, no,
just
no, no, no.
subsetting it.
No, because what CD events, what we're trying to do with CD events, at least from my perspective, is we're trying to give a common nomenclature, right? Where if we say this is an environment, it means these exact things. Tools can have their own independent definition of things, but once they adhere to CD events' events, they have to use the correct definition, right? That becomes very important in both interoperability and observability. Like if you start deviating or allowing for, however the tool defines them, you run into a real risk of like, what am I looking at from the end user's perspective? You muted, did I see? Or am
No,
I
I'm
lagging?
just listening.
Oh, okay. So, but that like, we need to be opinionated on these definitions. So it becomes, when people are sending events, we know exactly what it means when they're sending the event, right? So, and like tools like
So
your,
are we the consumers now?
no, 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 we are the specification, right? So we say when something is being sent, we know, like we define the criteria of what that thing is, right? That's the whole, that's the whole part of like the governance with CD events, right? Because we have these very strict, well, we need stringent definitions, to be able to, observe things appropriately or to interoperate in some sort of meaningful way, right? It becomes much more difficult when you have, when tools have their own definitions, and even when you have CD events layered on top of it, if you allow those definitions to leak into the CD events semantics, then it becomes very, very hard for tools to really behave like in a common fashion, right? So I think that's the problem that I'm kind of seeing with environment. I mean, and it's not limited to environment, by the way. I mean, it's, there's multiple, fields that are multiple things that we need to define. But that's why I started with like pipeline run, because like I wanted to make sure that when people are talking about pipeline run from a CD events perspective, it had a very strong definition, right? And so when a tool sends a pipeline run, it means these exact things, right? And I'm doing the same thing here with environment. So here's a long story short. When I was trying to do a definition for environment, I was like, I don't know how to define this because of like the examples of like how it's worded. It seems like it can be like anything, right? Which makes it very hard to come up with any sort of like useful definition from a CD events perspective. So that was kind of the context of like why I created this issue, because it seemed like it was conflating both the tiered representation, like I call it tier, which is like prod, dev, for example, and like the actual infrastructure, right? So the infrastructure would be like the cluster group or whatever that it may be, and and I think separating those out, or having environment contain like a tier field would help it as well. So I don't know what the exact solution is, but I think there's multiple solutions here that would help with defining this. Because then when we say what an environment is, we can say, oh, an environment is a cluster group that may or may not have a tiered label that is prod or non-prod, et cetera, right? So that becomes very, very clear on what it is. Because now people say, when we say environment, they're like, oh, it's not actually dev, staging, or production. Or I mean, that could be the overarching name, but it, it can also be this cluster group, right? Like, or it is that cluster group now. And then if we're talking about dev, staging, or production, we're talking about specifically the tier. Does that help? Or did I not make any sense? I feel like I kind of rambled.
Um, you're ex sure. I know you're saying the thing that I expected you to say, yes.
Okay. Um, and yeah, and I think, if the idea, because so here's my thinking, right? Like these semantics, we want to be opinionated. So if the disagreement is that we don't want environment to be defined opinionated, or we don't want to govern that, then I want to understand why, right? Because you can say we disagree, and that's okay, but we need to understand why we don't want to define environment like at that like level, right? And I think that's where if that is going to be the consensus, then I at least want to understand why we don't want to make that separation, and understand like, or make sure that we understand that, people that are using environment are now gonna, the tools can essentially diverge or have different meanings when they talk about environment, right? When they talk about in the CD events context, when they talk about in the tools context, it doesn't matter what they say, right? So is that what you're saying, did you see that we want to keep environment the way it is, and um and just basically allow people to use their own definitions regardless and not have any sort of formal definition of it? Or what are we trying to, I guess I'm trying to understand your argument.
I wasn't really trying to make an argument because you weren't really, you know, open to arguments that weren't the thing that you were saying. So I just kind of strayed away from that and let you say what you were saying. So that's how I handle it. I think environment or any of the fields in any of the things are definitely left up to the interpretation of the people who pick CD events off the shelf and do something with it. I get that you want it to enforce a semantic interoperability. Um, that says, hey, use it this way to do this thing. That's interesting consumer thing. I'm just wondering where um, you're you're saying that people who aren't using like Kubernetes, but they're supposed to like, can they not use the environment field? Do they have to use a different environment field? And then I do like the point that you're making about the thing where there is a addressable set of servers that you might want to track and call it, this is the location that it actually is in, whether that's, the data center location versus, that's a physical location of this environment versus a ephemeral identity of the environment, the label by which you're covering it. And that's how, at least what I'm hearing you say, that you'd like to split up those two concepts, unless you're only making this available for people with clusters, because clusters are the thing that's represented there. And then if I had like just regular servers, or if I had, digital equipment that was out in the field somewhere, like, could I not call those environments now? Like that's what I'm thinking of, all the other use cases that aren't just Kubernetes. Um, and how then are they supposed to use this environment field if they are doing something without clusters? Or are you going to give them someplace else to do that labeling for their concept, or like, all of the other things that come with a decision like that?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's what I was trying to land on, right? Like whatever definition that we make it, right? Um, and and to DC, so like I'm open to disagreements, but like I first want to get my points out. Like that's kind of like like how I usually go. And so I'm like trying to like build my case first, and then like you're interjecting like as of like this happened last time too, right? So and I appreciate you letting me finish, but that's why like at the end, I'm then after I get my points across, then I'm like, okay, so where's the disagreement? What are we trying to understand? What are we trying to do, right? Um, and so and I think too, right? Like you your understanding of like maybe we want maybe splitting them out and having like a location, but calling out we got to make sure that it sounds like you're calling out we got to make sure that it works for all the use cases where it doesn't work for a Kubernetes cluster, right? So and I think that's very that's true. And I think for environment, I could take a stab at the definition again, but like it was really hard to come up with any sort of definition that that it wasn't any sort of like cluster based thing. Because I was like, oh, it's like an instance group, it's a cluster group, it's an environment, like it's a running compute environment, if you will, right? Um, so
Yeah, and I guess I think of it as a label, and it's a label for that type of identity to group, you know, a set of tools together. And so I guess if I were trying to come up with a definition, I would be looking for the definition that fit the greater, larger group of use cases, not getting hyper focused on you must use it this way, and then say, hey, this is where you put these kinds of informations, because it, to the point that I guess, that wasn't really coming up in your explanation, is that it's beyond just Kubernetes, right? It's like, okay, but then what does environment become for all of those other things? Which is the point that I was trying to make when you were, adamantly telling me that I didn't understand, is that I do understand, is that, I get it. It's there, it's saying, it's giving you a use case, but it's one use case for the concept of environment. And the CD events should cover all of the general use cases for the concept of environment, not be like super specific, unless you want to say, hey, we want to support Kubernetes as a first-class citizen, and these are our Kubernetes things that we want to do. And I think that works too. Or even having a group of sub-events, or, I, for one, think there should be a looser event structure where people can create their own events. And that's going to be something we introduced towards like right before we launched the tool. And that's issue like 250, I think, is already in there. Yeah, and I think that's the real solution to that problem, is like, okay, you can add the fields to a thing that you feel you need, but then here are the base fields that the greater community says should be in everything, and and not really dictate the usage because the people who are building the thing know what they're doing with it. And so to say, well, you can only do it this way is telling them how they should build and use a thing, as opposed to something that's actually interoperable, where like tools can just slot in. And so the tools that use environment in a particular way would still slot in with the tools that use it in that particular way. And yeah, there's different ways to achieve interoperability. It doesn't have to be a draconian kind of, you can only use this to do consuming the way that we say. And I think that's what was part of what was super appealing about CD events coming out of the box, is that it was generic enough to support a lot of use cases, but at the same time direct enough to say, oh, we expect these things always to be there in these certain cases where we as a community know we're going to want to do something with the information.
Right. Yeah, so I want to make sure that because the intention there wasn't saying you should do it this way. What I'm saying is it's semantically defined like this within CD events. Those are two very different things, right? So I want to just be careful with because like that's all I'm trying to do is making sure that whenever we say something, it means exactly this. Because by your definition, this is not a label. This is a environment is a platform, right? Which may run a service. That's literally the definition right here. So that's not right based off your definition, right? So that's my point is like we need to fix these, right? Because like I have a different view on like how, but like what's the correct CD event? And that's what I was trying to do when I was creating this definition, because this felt too not like how I would use environment. So and I think what we might, it sounds like what we want to call out is that environment is a label that attaches to a platform. Would that be more accurate, do you think?
Okay, so just in this moment, you've both said that I said environment was a label and it wasn't, and then to say that environment is a label for a thing. So I'm gonna kind of back off because I don't want to, make this an issue. It's just a thing, dude.
No, no, no,
Um,
no, no. Sorry, I was asking. No, sorry. I think you misunderstood. So, okay, no, no, no. So here's what I was trying to say that right now it's not defined as a label, right? It's this. I'm saying is that the right change is what I'm asking. Because like I agree with you. I think it should just be a label that points to a platform. But I'm just saying like, does this does this current definition satisfy what you were talking about? And I was
Well,
like,
no, well,
from
I think we were in agreement on that. I mean, that part we were in agreement that what was there didn't, needed to be updated or corrected or something more general that fit all use cases. That's what I said was saying, that it needs to be something that fits all of the use cases in a very generic way. And, in that different use cases will want to use the label of environment in different ways. You, the the base generic way to think through that would be, okay, what is an environment? What's the common thing in all of these structures, and make that the definition of the label, so that it sounds like it fits that. But then you're left with that, do you want that semantic interoperability where if you're using a Kubernetes cluster, you are enforcing that thing? Like that's more like a, hey, consumer says it works this way versus the spec says this is the slot for it, where you put in information for environments and it fits this wide scope of things.
Mhm.
And so the real question is, are we trying to be super prescriptive in saying you must use this thing this way? Or are we saying these are slots where we know that you'll want to carry information that you know what to do with from one place to another, um, and and process it. But this is how we will commonly think about these slots. And so if you are in a Kubernetes situation and you're working with Kubernetes, you know that environment means this thing, or you're in another situation where environment might mean, the dev staging carry kind of situation. I guess from my perspective that it is a label and a choice of the person building the thing, and that it has to have some flexibility to cover a lot of use cases, not necessarily the ones that I say, hey, it must work this way. Now, granted, there are fields like that, like chain ID is a
Yeah,
great
yeah.
example of something that has to solve a particular problem. but that has to do with the mechanics of how the events work, right? Or how they relate to each other, as opposed to us telling the person, oh, your build must take these steps. Now we can say something like, well, all builds should have a build start and build finish. Just because you're saying build, and if you're going to emit the events, we should expect it to close itself, right? I think that's a fair thing to say overall for an enforcement kind of thing. But again, I'm not going to say, well, if you're going to do a Java build and you have a jar, we have to have a jar slot for all of the jars because only jars can go in the jar slot. It's like, oh, was
Yeah,
the
that would be
artifact.
terrible.
Well, no, but I mean, it's the same kind of thing. Like, but instead we use artifact, and so now it's more general and it solves a lot more use cases. And so I think this is kind of the same thing where we want to say, okay, we want the general thing that we're actually trying to say, and are we going to separate out the label of the virtual name of the thing as a
Yes.
label, or the address of the things as the entities that actually make up what's being labeled. And I think
Yes,
that's a
yes.
fair split, right? Because then we're saying those are two separate concepts mentally to everyone, right? It's like, oh yeah, I do have a bunch of servers. They might not be clusters. They might just be, it might be some old school place where there's like, they still run in
Data
VAX
centers
machines.
or something, right? Yeah,
Exactly,
exactly.
right? And
Yeah.
so like that's what I'm really trying to say, dude. It's like I think about it going, okay, it's got to work for everybody. And so that
Yeah,
was
yeah,
the
yeah.
only point that I was making. Like environment, it should be whatever the group needs it to be, right? But if you want to say, hey, physical addresses of servers, we have this slot and this concept for it, a conceptual ephemeral name for a group of servers is this other thing. That works fine too. I think that would solve your definition problem in a way that lets you do the thing, because then it could be like, oh, because this type, and then do you do types too, right? And say, okay, what type is this? This is a Kubernetes type of environment that has an addressable blah 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 that covers the blah, and then
Mm,
this is the virtual label that covers the that, and make environment maybe an object, right? And
yeah,
I think it
yeah.
already is an object though, right? Um, but that's all I'm saying. Like it's got to be generic and general enough to cover all of the use cases so that we aren't being hyper prescriptive and telling people what they have to do.
Yeah, yeah. And I agree 100%, and I think too, like a lot of the times, like we're talking about the same things. But for some reason, like things get lost in translation. But what I will do, DDC, is I'll create a PR that is my take on the label, and I want to ping you directly because like I know you thought about this a lot. And just make sure that it works for, if you see any issues with it, right? Because I'm going to create this definition, and then basically the idea here, right, is that name, would be essentially the virtual label, right? And the reason why I want to call this out, because if you look at this, so David, I'm going to talk about your point right here, is that he sees environment as the deployment target, right? Um, and he takes it as like the abstract here. So like, so I'm
Yes,
not, yeah. So I think,
because
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
for me, about interoperability, there are producer and consumer. So it's not just the presence of the field, as the DC mentioned, it's also how we interpret the content of the field.
Hmm?
And it should be clear how we can read the content and use it by the consumer. And in my case,
1000%, yeah.
and if it's just prod, I don't know if I want to trigger some stuff via the product of DDC or anything. I don't know exactly where I should um, trigger the stuff if the environment is too large or too not granular, not finely granular defined. Sorry for the English, but I needed to know on maybe which cluster in which region I want to trigger a post operation, an audit or something else, a cluster, a test. In my case, I use it to trigger some test
Yeah, yeah.
and etc. So it's why, and often in practice, in the company, and in your example, it's the same. The tier or audience or higher information are included and could into the deployment name and
Yeah,
could be
it's like this.
derived. So it's why I say, in my case at least, and in the previous company it was the same, we always name environment. It could be the VPC or it could be the Kubernetes cluster. I mentioned VPC because AWS Lambda or anything else doesn't, not Kubernetes specific, but it's sometimes we environment is a full region. We use different region for different purpose, etc. So I agree with both of you. It could be a lot of things an environment. It could be a single namespace in some cluster, but it should be precise enough to allow other tools to use it to do something. So in the sample, in your Spinnaker sample, instead of saying not available, you can say it's the name of the Kubernetes cluster. It's also the choice made by made in the Argo CD working experiment for CDEvent. It's the name of the cluster in Argo CD they used.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I think yeah, you definitely had a lot of good points there. So one thing that I'm kind of curious about though is because it still sounds like you want, because the environment is already tacked on like source, or like this source for example, right? Like you're okay doing the parsing to get that information. But what I was thinking is that is such an important piece of information that it needs to be standalone. Is that an okay, or would you rather have it like, because here's the issue that I have with it being on like source, for example, is that we don't really govern these, right? So like we don't know if someone's going to be sending this, a tool's going to be sending this, right? So that's the only issue that I have with this, is that we're kind of like mixing the deployment target here with the environment in this particular example, right? And so, and based off of how you were saying you handle it, right? So the thing that I was wondering is, should we separate that out, whether that's a new field or maybe we have like a label type of event? I don't like that, but whatever solutions that we come up with, but it feels like it needs to be something that's separate as opposed to, having it just be on a string, right? That you would derive it from.
I imagine in the past for this to extract this information from the ID in dashboard or tools, or to allow to link with another data source. In the demo that DC mentioned EDP.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, it's the good place. It was how I imagine in the past is to allow IDP is a static view today of the deployment SDLC, and CDEvents is a dynamic view, and to allow both systems to discuss together. So maybe the dashboard or tools that are using CDEvents and want to expose, by example, the team who owns the service, or if the tier that owns the environment, the target deployment, he can ask the system, he can ask EDP or some kind of third-party table to have the information. It's one approach.
Right, but okay, so yeah, it's definitely one. Okay, I see what you're saying. So you're saying that rather than surfacing it, we can just have the abstraction above it. But is that the best? Is that the best that we can do? I guess my question is this, right? Is like when we think about CDEvents, it's basically like facts, right? That about a deployment,
Yes.
right? So is production or dev a big enough fact to be on its own, whether that's a field or its own thing, right?
Well, wouldn't that be up to the software that's consuming it and doing something with it, not us particular in this group? I think that's part of what David is surfacing in his statement is that like you have to understand how the people want to use it, and that split up of those things a lot of times lives in other tools, right? Whether you're connecting to an IDP or an event bus, it's like, okay, but what are the people who are consuming the event going to do with it, and do they know? And if you say, oh, this is only for this ephemeral label, then you are saying to them, well, you can't use it for the other use case that you had been, where you were saying, no, it's for the actual physical group, right? It's the cluster group that I want to
Yeah,
represent with
yeah,
environment, right? But if it's just a generic field where it's like, okay, this is where you put this type of information, then the people who are writing software against the events can use it however they want to use it for their use case, but it still is environment. Now, that conflated usage is part of what I think we're trying to talk about and say, do we want to split it up? And again, it really boils down to, do we want to track the physical location of an environment, or any grouping of servers, or however somebody would want to do that, separate from the ephemeral label we put on the set. And the more we say it over and over again, I think that that is a fine, distinction between those two things, and it might have solved some use cases for some people. But then really be careful about how we do it and create that set. And, is it like, oh, you're like, how far do you want to go with it? Like, are we saying like, oh, well, we want to have the IP addresses too, or whether it's, this or that, or are you saying no, just the whatever you call the cluster names and DNS is what you need, or, is there some other identifier that you want to use for the clusters themselves, right? Um, or any
yeah.
cluster that you make in your own, that isn't necessarily Kubernetes, because clustering is a real concept that doesn't have anything, that goes beyond Kubernetes.
Yes,
Yeah, it's
yes.
just what use case are you trying to solve, and are we opening up to both the physical and the? I mean, that's what I hear when you guys are talking about it, right? There's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
ephemeral label versus the actual addressable thing. And
Yep, yep.
so do we want to split that out? And I don't have a problem with splitting that out, guys, just to be completely candid about that, because that's very specific, where we're saying, oh, this is where you put the label, and this is where you put the addresses. And perhaps we literally say something like, cluster address or cluster physical cluster, or something where we're saying this is the physical thing that you want to talk about versus the ephemeral one. It's just that in something like Kubernetes, the pods are technically ephemeral too. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
you can say it's that cluster over there, but where it is on the cluster, you still don't actually know. So yeah, it's all good. I mean, I just try to be open and let everybody do their thing.
Yeah, yeah, and I think too, like you all bring very very good points, and this is why I wanted to have this discussion, right? And I think too, when we're talking about specifically like environment and the definitions, right? Like, I think splitting it out just makes it a little bit easier for people to reason about, or at least for me, it does. It helps me, and it allows me to like make the definitions in a way where it's a little bit more strict, so that's the benefit that I see there. But the thing that I want to call that you made a really good point to DC, because I was just thinking about this just the other day, which I don't know if, so with CD events, it's definitely a balance between granularities and what we want to include, right? And I'll give you an example, right? So commits are a fact, a fact about the life cycle of of a piece of software, right? But we don't necessarily want to capture that, right? Like like people, they might care about it, but that it's probably not CD Events' job to surface that fact to the consumers of CD Events, right? So there's definitely a balance, right? And so the question always then becomes, if this balance, like with environment, are we teetering in the right direction, right? Like, should we include the label? Should we include the infrastructure that's pointing to, right? And the thing that you said there, like keep it like the IP, right? Like when I hear like we want to include the IP, I'm like, oh, that's probably something we don't want to include, right? So it's definitely a balancing act. And I think that's what is really important, is trying to figure out like where we land in trying to balance these things, right? Because like, like commit, like you could make an argument that it belongs in CD events, right? Like, but in my opinion, right, we probably shouldn't have it, but you could definitely make an argument because it is a fact, something that people want to observe. Even consumers, right? They might want to understand like what commits are going out, what commits, have what sort of diffs, and et cetera, right? But that isn't the only criteria, it seems like, right? It seems like there's a little bit more. So it's really hard to know, when we're introducing, new concepts, new fields, where we line up, right? And so that's why, I wanted to bring this discussion because like even me, like when I'm thinking about like, oh, where does this become too granular? Are we splitting this out just to split it out and it really has no benefit? Or what is the main benefit of being able to separate these things? And for me, when you're able to separate, like, or when you're able to give like labels versus their, like their cluster group, is that 99% of the time, people in terms of observability and metrics, they're going to care about the label as opposed to like the cluster names, right? So that's why I was like, that the environment should, when we're talking about those things, we probably should have label in the definition somewhere. So that's kind of like how I came, like full circle back to the definitions. Um, and I hope that that makes it clear like where I'm trying to like figure this line is. Um, and it sounds like, so both the DC and David, would both of you be okay with saying that environment is a label that points to some sort of platform or whatever definite, whatever we want to call that target? Does that work?
Yes, and yes, it definitely, if the company is big enough to have an IDP, it should be related to the IDP. But for starting, it's not the case for a lot of company. They can, and if they want just to start, they will use an internal label. Today, I don't have IDP or IDP integration. I inject the name of the environment based on from where the environment comes from, and I name it. It's the demo, it's the prod, and I provide different endpoint for both to do the distinction, because Kubernetes doesn't know its own name. A Kubernetes cluster doesn't know its own name, how it is named
Yeah.
outside. So it's, as I monitor directly Kubernetes, it's it's hard coded, but and I need to have this information to provide some dashboard without integration with a third party IDP.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's a balance. And for team big enough, they will say, oh, we will use our own internal name, or that can we correlate later with our IDP to provide maybe a more granular or space or different definition, and maybe for a C-level, we will aggregate information, all the regional cluster into one view. But often, in the scale-up I work, I didn't work in big tech. I work for Samsung, but not at this, not for Kubernetes. But for scale-up, CTO is aware of every region. At least he knows that he have 3 regions and 1 cluster per region. So it's really depends on the size of the company also, I think.
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. And okay, yeah, that definitely helps. And another thing that I want to call out related to environment here is that service deployed, um, yeah, has this environment object. Uh, but I think in our schema, if you look in our schema, it actually doesn't include it. So go to our schemas real quick. And this is why I really don't like having to duplicate like the definitions over and over in our schemas, because things get missed. So if you look at service deployed, environment only has these 2 fields.
Yes, because it's a reference. It's the way it's related to the ticket and all the discussion I raised a few times. It's how we link a subject each between, except for artifact, as we have this sample below. We always use ID plus source to create a link to another subject or to something else.
Yeah, so So I'm gonna go with what Didisha was saying, like working for like all the tools, and like the problem with Spinnaker is they don't have a concept of environment, and it's a required field, right? And if the required field had the name there, we could just put like a name, like, oh, this is going to prod, this is going to dev. But because we don't actually have an ID, we can't
But you have the name
use.
of the cluster in Spinnaker. Spinnaker know where it deploy where it's running the deployment. What is the target of the deployment? So you can agree to use the
But okay,
ID
so
of
we
the
use this
target.
ID, right? Then I want to get the
Yeah.
label. How do I get the label?
Indirectly, it's you can extract it, I mentioned, from the name. You could have your rules, or you could go to if you have the entity events and the entity tables, the environment tables that is related to environment creation, etc. If you look at it, you may extract the name and all the other information.
So they would have to know that this is coming from Spinnaker, and then they would have to then do the parsing.
It's depends how you name it. In my previous company with multi regions, we have naming convention. So with the ID of an environment, we know if it's a prod, if it's a US, if it's Virgin, what is the data center, etc. Everything is included in the ID of the environment.
Yeah. But my point is we might have multiple CD tools in one company, right? And so
Yes.
Spinnaker would send it differently from another tool, and then we would have to know when Spinnaker is sending it to parse it out, right?
Sorry, I didn't understand the last sentence.
So yeah, my point is, so let's say we have a CD tool that's able to send the event or environment events as well as the service deployed events or service upgraded events, right? So what
Yes.
happens there is when they send a service deployed or upgraded, we're able to just look up the ID because environments exist as a first class citizen in that CD tool, right? And we're able to get the label, which is, let's say, dev or prod. Spinnaker does the same event, service deployed, doesn't have the environment concept. Now
Yes,
we
but
need to know.
you have the cluster concept.
Yeah, but if I want to go look up, so what I'm saying is the same flow becomes different, right? Because what I'm getting at is we look to say, hey, right, let's go look up this ID. Wait, this environment doesn't exist in this ID. Let's parse it out, right? So we need to know how Spinnaker now, because it might be not Spinnaker, it might be a different tool, how it
Hmm?
forms this ID to parse out that label.
It's your company convention, I will say. Because if in your company you have maybe Spinnaker and Argo CD, I guess at least if both tools publish to the same cluster, they will name the cluster with the same name. So they are able to reconcile it.
Yeah. I mean, the cluster is fine. Like that's not an issue, right? But what I'm saying is like they can't get the label without parsing it out, like in some sort of
Yes,
expected format, right?
yes. But what is but having these labels is, I will say, it's needed. It's if the consumer of the event need to have this information.
Yeah, actually, I would argue that the label is more important than where it's going, actually, like the actual cluster.
But today, as with my example, I said it's the opposite. Label
Oh,
is user friendly, but for other tools, they prefer to have the ID and maybe derive the labels if it's needed
no,
by a
well,
lookup table. Sorry.
yeah. I think it depends who your audience is. Definitely, if you're like a dev, like I want to know like where it's going, right? But like if you also say that it's going to prod, I know exactly where that's going to, right? So, but I can't do it the other way. Like if I know it's prod, oh, I just go look at the prod clusters, right? Like, and I have that, but I can't go the other direction without looking up the clusters and seeing what's in prod, right? Um, and what I'm getting at there is that because we have to kind of like I guess either parse out the label or get the label in some manner, and why it's more important is because generally you care when prod fails, you care when prod rolls back, right? That becomes very, very important, right? So in terms of an observability standpoint, prod, that label is very, very high, right, in terms of priority. So and I'm not saying, yours, like the destination is not important, but what I'm saying is that when you're coming at it from an observability standpoint, which is, a lot of, we market CDEvents as also observability, labels is generally the more important thing, right? At least, when you're looking at, what made it to production, why things are being rolled back from production to staging, why, how many, how many times dev broke over the last month, right? Like those are things that we
Yes.
really care about measuring, right?
Yes.
But with the cluster ID, all we could do is tell where it went to help debug something. So those are two very different problems. Those very, very useful, but
But with the cluster ID, I know if it's prod, dev, or staging.
oh yeah, yeah. Assuming you are the same person that's doing the observing, yes. If you are the same team doing the observing, absolutely. But you might not be. If you're a totally different team, how will they know your cluster is in prod?
Uh, as I mentioned, often you know which cluster is prod, which cluster is dev.
Your team does. Your team does. Yes, but I'm
No, no,
saying
no, no,
that.
no, 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 no. We 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 when I work with we work at, at least we are, as I mentioned, but we naming convention etc. was defined at the group level. It was not a per team naming convention. So DevOps of every team agree on how they name stuff, and we have specific dashboard per team. But when we want to, when for cross stuff or cross cluster team, we know how cluster where if a cluster is a prod or dev, etc. Especially when we have communication between cluster.
Yeah, but yeah, in order to do that though, you need to have the label in the cluster then, right?
Yes, in our case, we include the labels as part of the name of the cluster.
Yeah, I think that's my question, right? So if the label's in the name, right, we now need to parse it out, right? And then if we ever want to change that format, it becomes very, very difficult, right? So
Yes, for legacy stuff, we have this issue, and we have a lookup tables where we know which server it was for legacy machine, especially where we know this machine is a prod machine, this machine is this node is a dev node, and we have to use this third party to have this information. But if we want a tool to add this label, it also means that the tools that will create the event have to go into a third party system, maybe to retrieve this label, to inject this label into this events, etc. So it's maybe more works for itself, for the tools.
yeah, I mean, it's more work then, right? Well, it's more work you just hitting a different endpoint to get so I would say that's pretty small, but like making any sort of changes becomes very, very difficult with your proposed solution, right? Or the proposed way of just having it in the ID. So I'm wondering, so I guess my point is why don't we just have the full environment? I mean, it's in the docs, right? Like, so either the docs are wrong where it says that this service deployed should be the environment object, or so what we do is either A, we fix this where we include the environment actual object, or B, we fix the docs to say, hey, This is not an environment object. It's two fields from the environment object, right? So that's kind of like what I'm getting at. So that was actually my original concern, but then we kind of went off on a tangent. But so what is the preference here? To match the docs or fix the docs?
Match the docs.
Okay, so if we're gonna match the docs, then we need to put all the stuff in here. Um, okay, I'll create an issue for that. Maybe that's better. I'll just create this issue as well. So okay, so I will go ahead and create a PR for that, but then I'll have another PR. Okay. Andres
Today
back.
I use the ID as a reference. It's how I use, as I already said, I don't use source, just
Okay.
ID. I could use a URN. It's if in your company you want to name, you could use URN as you mentioned to links.
Yeah.
And if I want to pass additional information, that's the case sometimes. I follow the DDC approach. I use custom data where I create a namespace, a first level namespace for some additional information. For example, for GitHub information, I add information from the GitHub events as part of custom data GitHubs, and I put everything to avoid conflict.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Okay, cool. So what I'll do, all right, so it sounds like we're in agreement that at least we need to conform to what the docs say. So I'll go ahead and fix that. What I will do is I'll also update the definition here to reference like label as opposed to being like like the target. And then we can roll out and figure out whether or not we want to like actually do the separations. I think doing baby steps first, seeing how it lands, and then if we need to separate out, we always can, right? So I think that, yeah, I think that works. Okay, so here I will put 6 events to match docs. Change documentation to reference environments as labels to targets. Okay, I think that works. All right, and then for the other thing that I had, which was basically that was it. Okay, was there anything else?
We don't have time.
Oh, we only have 2 minutes. Wow, that took a long time. Okay. Okay. Yeah, thanks everyone. I always appreciate the feedback. And I think we landed on a really good solution. One, just updating the docs to, say, that environments are just a label that, reference targets. Then we'll fix the events to match the docs. And then if that isn't enough, we can always split them out in the future. Are we happy with that? That sounds fair?
Yes, maybe we could amend examples and
Add some examples.
to clarify the different use case and possibilities.
Okay, yeah, that works perfect for me then. Okay, awesome. Thanks everyone again, and then yeah, like I said, we'll hopefully get these PRs merged in sometime next week. Then appreciate everyone's time, and then we'll meet up again next week. All right, bye everyone.
Bye.